Hello everybody and welcome to Lois and Morgana Davidson Art. It's Morgana here and today I'll be painting mountains under moonlight for you with a beautiful lake in watercolour. I was inspired by this reference photo which I found on the image hosting website petsales.com. And the first step I took was to roughly pencil in the shape of some beautiful mountains on my watercolour paper, along with a small boat and a single horizontal line for the lake. My next step was then to cover the top part of the paper with clean water, ready to begin the first wash. I'm only using 4 colours for today's painting. They're on screen at the moment, but as usual I'll pop a list of everything that I'm using today in the description of this video. So I'm going to begin today with some Payne's Grey. This is going to be the main colour that I'm using in my sky. As such, you can see I'm putting it on quite thickly and using my large mop brush. I want a bit of texture and movement in my sky, so this is why I'm using the mop brush rather than a big flat brush to cover all the ground, so to speak. And I'm bringing the colour right down to the horizon line as far as I've placed the water for this first wash. And now here you can see I'm actually introducing even more water onto the paper with the mop brush, and this is just to get a little bit more movement across the paper with that Payne's Grey, and just to get it to create some interesting shapes. I don't want this to be too flat a wash. I want some nice movement and texture as the paint dries. With that extra bit of water we should hopefully get some beautiful sort of cloud and shadow shapes occurring almost naturally with the movement of the paint and the water. So whilst that's getting on with that, so to speak, I'm just adding in a little bit of yellow here. We've got some raw sienna and some lemon yellow hue going in. And this is just a tiny little drift of colour to break up this very deep blue-ish Payne's Grey that we've got going on. And I'm just bringing this colour down across the mountains here. We can still see the pencil outline once it's dry, so don't worry about the colour being too dark. And I'm just using a slightly smaller mop brush to do a little bit of blending and just move this colour around. Being quite careful, of course, with this yellow. We're placing it next to a quite blue tinted grey, and of course if we do too much blending then there is always the risk of creating a nice green sky, which I'm sure you'll agree isn't quite the effect that we're going for here. And this is a really nice handy little technique. You can use a piece of clean tissue to lift paint from the paper, leaving behind nice clean white marks, and I'm doing it here just along the edge of these golden areas that I've painted with the yellow. These are just little glimmers of light, and I'm just edging them here with the white marks left by the tissue. You can see I folded it up here to get a crisp edge, and it's really useful to just drag it along where the paint is wet and it lifts the colour in a nice clean line. Get these hints of sort of clouds and little glints of light. Now do bear in mind you can only do this while the paint is still quite wet. It won't work when the paint is dry. But now I'm going to be using the coin trick to lift out a lovely bright round full moon. I'm using a 5p piece, and you can see I'm just wrapping it up in a little bit of piece of tissue quite tightly so you get a nice round shape, and then placing it quite carefully but quite decisively into the paper and then lifting it out cleanly, and we're left with this lovely round shape here. And that is our very simple full moon. And as you can see I'm doing here, you can use a small soft brush to just soften down any hard edges. As you can see there, I'm just softening the lower edge of the moon into that golden glow, so it's like we've got this spill of golden light coming from the moon, spilling over the clouds and across the sky. So now the painting is fully dry, that first wash, So you can see I'm easily able to put in the mountain shape as the pencil line that I drew before is showing quite cleanly through that first wash, which is really nice. For the mountains, I'm using a blend of neutral tint, some Payne's Grey and some raw sienna mixed with lots of water. You can see it is quite a loose and light mix. I didn't want to come in too heavily with the paint. I liked layering up with some looser, more watery paint to begin with. And I think it helps to create that nice translucent effect with layers that you often see in watercolour. And you can see I'm still using my large mop brush just to get really nice good coverage. One of the nice things about this big mop brush is that it has quite a sharp pointed tip to it, so it means that you can switch between covering quite a lot of paper to doing quite sort of fine work with the point quite easily. You can see that this lovely deep grey mountain colour is going really nicely over the initial wash, despite being quite thinned down with plenty of water. And we're getting a lovely crisp shape for the mountains. You'll see that I am leaving some parts with the wash peeping through, so to speak, just on the edges of the mountains here, and that's because I want to do a little bit of highlighting there. And this as well is a really nice simple way to add texture into big sort of bits of land like this. Basically using the same colour that you already have on your palette, but just sort of blotting it in and sort of splotching it in almost with your brush, creating interesting shapes that are quite loose and quite ragged and unformed, so to speak. And then just letting that dry. As the water sort of dries, it will soften the edges and you get this interesting sort of quite loose mountainous rocky texture without having to sit and painstakingly figure it out bit by bit. You can see I'm just sort of splotching away here, and as it's drying, some parts are drying paler than others, some parts are drying darker, which is really nice to see. And here I'm just connecting up the tops of those mountains, and you can see how fine the tip of this brush is actually, considering its size. This is a size 20 brush, and it can actually do a really nice fine line, so which is why I'm using it for, well, everything. Now at this point you can see that I'm actually lifting a little bit of the colour out of this paler area of the mountainside here, using a clean brush and some clean water. You can also do it using a tissue, which I'll show you in just a moment, but this is just because I actually really like the effect of the light sort of spilling down from the moon and across the mountainside. So I'm just lightening these areas up a bit to enhance that effect. And there you go, just dabbing a little bit out with the tissue after I've wet it with the clean water and the brush, and that lifts it even further, and we get this nice sort of glow across the tops of the mountains there. So now I'm turning my attention towards the lake, and I'm using my large mop brush and brushing it very lightly over the paper surface here. You can see with the mop brush you can actually sort of pinch and prod the bristles into shape. They have no sort of spring to them, but they are very flexible, as you can see. And as I'm dry brushing, you can see it's actually bringing up the embossed name of the paper that I'm painting on. Those of you who can read backwards will see that it is Saunders Waterford paper that I'm using. This is where the logo is actually pressed or embossed into the paper itself, which is why it's showing up here in the dry brush. Which is a really nice fun little feature actually, although if you're not keen on it, then if it becomes part of the painting you can always cover that up with a mount or a frame, or simply cut it off once you're done. But the reason my dry brushing is looking a little patchy here is because I'm using hot press paper to paint this. And hot press paper is incredibly smooth. It's really lovely to paint on. You can get some wonderful diffusion and lovely skies, but it does not dry brush very well. But this is proof that it can be done. You just need the right brush and a gentle hand. So here I'm dry brushing again using the same technique, just stuffing the very edge of my brush, which is only half loaded with water. It's quite a dry brush, hence I suppose the term dry brushing. And I'm just using a combination of the two yellows that I used earlier, so a little bit of the lemon yellow and a little bit of raw sienna mixed up on the palette, and I'm just drifting this path of light across the surface of the lake here. I want to keep plenty of white paper very visible, just to give a sense of movement on the surface of the water, the light catching in sort of ripples and sparkles across the surface of a windblown lake. And now using the same movement but more paint. I'm not too worried about keeping the white of the paper, but I am worried about getting the shapes right. This is just the reflection or the shadow of the mountain going over the lake here. And again, just painting this in really loosely with the mop brush, and just trying to echo or mirror the mountain shapes, not trying to be too terribly precise with it, but obviously we still want that to be a very evident reflection. I am also trying to keep, you see this little band of white in between the mountain and the lake, just to give the impression of that sort of distant sparkle of water across the lake there, going in towards where the mountains obviously begin. You'll notice, of course, that I'm painting the reflections of the mountains using a slightly lighter colour than the paint that I used to paint the mountains themselves. This is just to make sure that this shadow or reflection isn't too heavy and it doesn't pull the viewer's eye away too much from the mountains themselves as a feature of the painting. So I'm happy with the balance of colour there in the reflections. I will just add quickly that to make that sort of muddy mountain colour, I used the same mix of paints that I used before, just in slightly different quantities. I used a bit of neutral tint, some Payne's Grey and some raw sienna, but for the reflections I added more raw sienna, so it became slightly lighter and slightly more yellowish. But here you can see I am beginning to paint the boat, and this is slightly fiddly but relatively simple because I already have the pencil outline there peeking through the dry brush, which makes it really nice and easy to come in with a small round brush and to just follow those lines and get a nice little boat shape sitting on our lake. Now, using a flat brush, all I'm going to do is pull a little bit of colour down from the hull of the boat and into the lake, which is going to act as the boat's reflection. And now, using the flat brush again with a little bit of neutral tint, I'm just going to deepen some of the shadows here at the edge of the lake. This is why I always paint in scenes like this a little paler than perhaps they should. It's always easier to come back in and darken down some areas after the fact than it is to lift colour cleanly if you accidentally put it in too dark. And now I'm happy with that. I'm using my fine brush to just put in a trio of very simple birds flying up into that beautiful Payne's grey sky. And lastly, using the flat brush to very simply put in a simple wake for this lovely boat, again using some more Payne's grey. And there we are, the painting is finished. Thank you everybody very much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know what you thought of it in the comments. I really enjoyed painting this one, and I hope you enjoyed watching it too. Please do feel free to hop over to my Patreon page, where following the link below you can actually watch me paint the companion piece or sister to this painting, which is a sunrise rather than a moonrise, inspired by the same photograph and showing the same beautiful mountains and lake. But thank you everybody again for watching. That's all from me this week. So I look forward to seeing you all in the next video and wishing you very happy painting.